Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mark, and this is actually a defense of Charles Bukowski. So, I've tried to make this a video a few times and I've had a bit of an issue with the camera. If I sound slightly hoarse, it's because I've talked through this now several times. What I'm going to do is mention that I'm sitting mostly in front of my French literature section, and I'm saying that because today we're in France, where Bukowski, B-U-K-O-W-S-K-I, is Bukowski. And he's not a drunk on a bench, he's an exotic American. And so I'm going to be talking very briefly about his 6 novels. I'm going to go through those, and then we're going to talk about his short stories, and then I'm going to give you my defense. And my sitting in front of my French literature section is significant for my defense. So, Bukowski. Here we go. The first novel that he wrote is called Post Office. Post Office is a novel in the style of Celine and Hampson. And we basically get a guy working at a post office. We get a lot of reflection on his time working through his day-to-day routine. In the post office, he's a male person. There's a scene in here, a mention of sexual assault, which is basically impossible to defend, but we need to basically set it aside to read the novel effectively. And what I would say is that it's only a sentence or two. It's written as if it's comic, which makes it worse. But that's basically where we are with this. And despite its faults, I'm going to rate Post Office as an A-tier book. So this is an A-tier Bukowski book. This is his best. He doesn't get any S tier. Okay, so for Bukowski's second work, what we've got is Women. And Women is a decent novel. It's not great. Nothing that Bukowski wrote is particularly great. This is a male indulgence in the sex world. Essentially, the book is about somebody who hits middle age, finally his success as a writer, and this grants him access to women. And they admire him deeply and want to be a part of his life. And it's crude, and it's in your face. And there was a group of writing that came out probably in the mid-century that was kind of spearheaded by Nabokov. That's what I like to call the wordplay sex novel. It would be Lolita, Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, and books from John Updike like A Month of Sundays. And I would say that this is a similar novel, except insofar as it's Bukowski. So there isn't really wordplay in the novel. It's much more forward and essentially English writing. Or not English writing, it's more Whitman-esque, let's call it. I would say the novel's a B. There's lots of sex in the novel. You have to basically put up with that. If you're not interested in reading that, you're not going to be interested in the novel. Nothing that Bukowski wrote is an S tier, so this is his B novel. What I would say is that the book is worth your time, but it's not ideal. And beyond that, you can kind of go with it. You can make allowances for it and move on. So that's the second novel. Bukowski's third novel is Ham on Rye. And Ham on Rye's title either comes from an allusion to J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, or it's about Charles Bukowski being a ham writer, somebody who's self-aggrandizing, and he's on rye whiskey. The novel is not incredible. I'm going to say it's a B novel as well, and essentially say that there are a few things in here that I like. He insults Nazis, which is always pretty fun. He does not like the skinheads in California. But there's also humor in here that I don't like. There's a scene where a teenage boy pees in a family's milk, and this is written off as just like hilarious. And to me, it's just not that good. So you basically take this with what you can. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. Ham on rye. It is what it is. Bukowski's fourth novel is called Factotum. Factotum is, well, the word means day laborer. The novel ends with a scene at a racetrack. So we know that Bukowski is a hard-drinking guy who likes to gamble. Just telling you that up front. Like Post Office, there's a scene of what might be sexual assault, but it's written off in here as essentially what no means yes. Of course, we don't want to endorse that. Other than that, the book is a kind of an okay adventure story to a point. Bukowski meets a very wealthy man with access to women, and so on and so forth. I'm going to again give this a B. So Bukowski does have worse stuff than B. There's not really an S tier book, like I said, but we've got B writing. Our next book is Hollywood, and Hollywood is about Bukowski's time writing the movie Barfly, writing for it. He's in Hollywood, he meets a number of writers, there's a character based on Norman Mailer. I don't think the book is particularly good. That the writing is not particularly creative comes through often here. Bukowski's charm is somewhat that he writes very simply, but here that becomes an impediment, and all we're getting is this kind of meditation on alcoholism and writing in New York, Hollywood. So take that for what you want. I'm going to give the novel a C or a C minus, and there's not a huge amount else to say. Bukowski's last novel is Pulp, and Pulp is a pulp story, a pulp fiction story. We do get an idea that if Bukowski had wanted to, he probably could have written successful detective fiction, given his style and what he does do well in this book. That said, the book is a total failure. It goes from basically pulp detective story to pulp science fiction. The writing is uninspired, and this is his worst novel by far. So this is what it is. There's a very famous scene to Celine. The book may not be great, but it's certainly there. If you're reading all of Bukowski's novels, there's no reason to avoid it. It is what it is. The last book of fiction that I'm going to be looking at is Bukowski's short stories, Hot Water Music. And we're going to give this an A. And I'm going to say that although I like some of his novels more than this book at times, that there are so many stories in here. There are about 30 fairly short stories. The book really deserves a second look or reviewing at all, as the case may be. Bukowski actually wrote numerous short stories, which is going to come up when I give you my defense in a moment. But there are some things in here where the humor does not quite meet the standards of today. He's obviously, Bukowski is a drunk on a bench. But the book overall is pretty solid and entertaining. It's just not great literature. So we're going to say that this is an A. And I do encourage people to actually read Hot Water Music. The other work of his I probably wouldn't recommend to everybody, but for the simple fact that this is a short story voice that did write so many short stories, it's necessary to look at. Okay, so now we're going to make our defense of Charles Bukowski. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to point out my good old French shelf here and say that today we're in the land of Bukowski rather than Bukowski. Bukowski is how the French say Bukowski based on my experience from listening to a podcast that reviewed him. The podcast I'm going to link down below for anybody who may happen to speak French, but Bukowski made quite a name for himself in France. There's a very famous scene from the French interview show Apostrophe, which is a literary interview show where Bukowski showed up and basically felt like he didn't fit in, and he proceeded to get so drunk they essentially kicked him off the show and told him he wasn't allowed back. By way of this, he ended up selling a huge amount of books in France. He made a name for himself, so that really helped him, popularized him. Regardless, what we're looking at with French is here, if you see this writer here, this is Virginie Despentes. Virginie Despentes is a very famous French writer. She's written 2 books that were turned into movies where she directed the movie. The first is Baise-Moi, and the second is Bye Bye Blondie. Additionally, she won a Prix Renaudot for Apocalypse Bébé, and she has said that her 2 favorite writers are Kathy Acker and Charles Bukowski. So she introduced me to Kathy Acker. I'm going to be rereading all of her fiction because it shouldn't take too long, especially since I love her. She's one of my favorite writers. But she's a very prestigious voice in the French literary world. Not only has she won a Renaudot, but she has had 2 books turned into movies. She's had her Vernon Subutex trilogy turned into a TV show, and she's acted as a judge for literary prizes. One of her favorite novelists is Bukowski. The second writer I want to mention is over here, and that's Alain Mabankou. And I believe Alain Mabankou is a French teacher at a university in California at the moment. But he's from Africa, Francophone Afrique, and I believe his Vercasse, which is probably his most famous novel, Broken Glass, has an allusion to Bukowski. Vercasse has a huge number of allusions to famous Francophone canonical work, especially the post-colonial variety. And Vercasse, I believe, as I said, has an allusion to Bukowski, and I think that this is significant because of who Mabankou is. So we've got 2 writers now, one from France and one from Francophone Africa, basically singing the praises of Bukowski. The last writer I want to talk about is Denis Leferrier. And Denis Leferrier's How to Make Love to a Black Man Without Getting Tired. The French title is essentially that, but you can see there's a word that I don't want to pronounce because I don't want to be misunderstood. This book contains, I think, a few allusions to Bukowski. So we've got now Alain Mabankou was a prize winner in France. He won a Renaudot, and he won numerous African literary prizes. And Denis Leferrier is a member of the Académie Française, which is essentially a governing body of the French language. In the U.S., we don't have a comparable governing body about English, nor in the U.K. So what I'm saying is these are 3 very prestigious voices that have praised Bukowski, or Bukowski, as a foreign writer, an import for them. Finally, as I said, I listened to a podcast that discussed Bukowski recently, and the podcast had a college professor who talked of Bukowski and Tom Waits as representations of American culture. So although Bukowski is an American writer who in the U.S. does not necessarily get quite the accolades that he does abroad, it's important to understand that when people are looking at American culture, he is representative of a facet. Now, one thing I want to add to this is that I had an experience when I was in college where a guy who read very much and was worked very hard at his writing once described himself as, "I'm not a great writer, I'm no Charles Bukowski." Now, this is significant because if I were to say I'm not a great writer, I would say I'm not a great writer, I'm no William Shakespeare. And I think it would be much more common in many college environments to hear something like, "I'm no Shakespeare." Maybe "I'm no Thomas Pynchon," but certainly not "I'm no Bukowski." But it's important because for this guy, Bukowski was so strong. And not everybody has the opportunity or the interest to read, let's say, the most literary works of the literature world. So for that sense, Bukowski is definitely a working class writer that it's worth paying attention to. Not everybody is going to necessarily agree with absolutely everything, but here we've got Bukowski doing his thing, and yeah, it's if I value that guy's opinion, maybe it's necessary for me to take seriously what his interests are as well. They may not reflect mine. I might not be able to hold it above people as easily that, "Oh, I like Bukowski. Who do you mean? Blah, 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 blah. I like Thomas Pynchon," and so on and so forth. But he is a working class writer with a very strong readership, and that readership is certainly intelligent, if nothing else. I guess what I'm getting at by citing these very prestigious writers from another culture who took the time to look into Bukowski and really read him, I want to point out that this is something that we're poo-pooing on ourselves. So there is talent there, there is material there. Now, I understand that in Germany and Austria, it's much the same thing. Bukowski is reviewed much more favorably. And when we're looking at writers in the U.S., although the tradition of decadence typically comes from, in the U.S., we understand that it's France, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Apollinaire, etc. And Bukowski, by this French podcast I mentioned, is placed in that tradition. We do still have Hubert Selby Jr., who I think is a better writer, and we have William Burroughs. So here I am adding to that I've looked into this tradition of Selby Jr. and Burroughs, and we've got Bukowski. The last thing that I want to talk about is Bukowski's hot water music and his short fiction. Bukowski's short fiction is not necessarily the best short fiction in the world. I have mentioned that I'm a bit of a short story snob, and there have been times when I've read a great deal of short fiction. For me, the short fiction love affair really started when I read Anton Chekhov, and I had read Francine Prose's How to Read Literature Like a Writer, and she recommends reading all 13 volumes of Constance Garnett's Chekhov to become a writer. And so I read all 13 volumes of Constance Garnett's Chekhov. I'm still not a great writer, unfortunately. I'm not working for a magazine or having, stories published or getting paid for anything, really. And I'm just a guy. But what I will say is I have an English degree, and I've seen the stories that we read in English classes. The stories that we read in English classes are normally the best short stories by the best writers. And all we're seeing is the best short stories by the best writers. And what I want to say is that it's a bit like trying to be a guitar player if all you're hearing is like the experimental stuff of Schoenberg or the great opera of Mozart or Bach or whoever, Beethoven. If all you do is see that, and you're working with these hour-long pieces or so on, and these huge orchestral work, and your job is what you want to do is write, punk music, you're going to be shit out of luck. You're SOL. You haven't seen the whole world. It's great that you know the great stuff, but you're missing out. And this is kind of what you're missing out on. You're missing out on kind of the working class narrative. You're missing out on the very simple sentences. You're missing out on the stories about the time at a bar. Why not write a story about a time at a bar? No, you won't get published in the New Yorker if you're only writing short fiction that takes place at the dive bar down the street. If that's what you do and that's what you write, you're not going to be published in the New Yorker. But that doesn't mean that you won't be published, and it doesn't mean that there's not a potential market for your fiction. And it's a damn shame to think that the only thing that's going to get you published, or the only thing that's going to make your literary life better, is the best of the best. We can't all be that. And even if you're in line to be the best of the best, I'm willing to bet the only reason why you're in line to be that is because you've taken the time to see the worst of the worst as well. And so what I wanted to say was, when I was talking about Chekhov, the thing that Chekhov did for me, the most important thing, was that I saw his best work and his worst. And when the Russians talk about Chekhov, apparently what they talk about is that Chekhov's a friend. Tolstoy's like a god among men, and so is Dostoevsky. But Chekhov is a friend. And we become friends with a writer when we see them be human and make mistakes. And so reading about 220 Chekhov stories for me was an opportunity to see all the different ways that he had succeeded and failed in different avenues with short fiction, and to make that work. And Bukowski has written more short story collections than just Hot Water Music. He wrote Hot Water Music, but he wrote, I think, 2 or 3 other collections that are published by City Lights. And so you're getting about, say, 100 some stories by Bukowski. I've only read Hot Water Music, but they're there. And if you're interested in them, you should read them. So I'm going to say a final word on my defense of Bukowski. And you might not like it, and I'm willing to accept that. But what I'm saying is that if the only thing that you're reading is Cormac McCarthy because he's the best prose stylist, you're missing a whole world of other valuable stories. You're missing out on a whole world of other valuable work. And Bukowski is a great place to look if you want to read somebody who's not just a principal Californian writer, but who does certain things very well and certain things horribly. And you're getting your punk rock music with Bukowski. You might want to make the best punk rock that you've ever heard, but you can't make punk rock if all you're hearing is Beethoven. If that's all you're paying attention to, you're certainly no punk artist. So if you're trying to write stories for yourself about who you are, it might be valuable to look into Bukowski. Alright guys, so as I said, I tried to make this video a few times. I've been working on a new camera and I was having some trouble with it, so I've ended up having to record and re-record. That's all I can really say. If I had to rank Bukowski as a writer, I'd put him as slightly worse than Hubert Selby Jr., but in the same line as the decadent art tradition that includes everything from Baudelaire to William Burroughs. He's certainly somebody to be aware of if all your experience so far has been solely the best of the best. That's everything. Thanks. Several books out.